Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Scarlett here again with the next chapter of Tormented Past. And this time it's going to be chapter 4, No Mercy. And let's just jump right in. One year, seizing an opportunity too good to pass up, James decided to launch an attack on the farm. Taking Daniel along for the ride, the farm was entering its most productive and financially successful time of the year, one which would provide enough income to allow them to live comfortably until business picked up again the following season. While Paul Sr. and Jr. were out of town, he went to his father's cousin's store to buy poison with the intention of ruining the harvest and killing off some animals. Yeah. While he went to pay for his purchase, James was turned down by his cousin David, who was working the store that day, declining the payment. David told James that he wanted to see him more often and had tried to stay in contact, but that Paul and Anastasia wouldn't allow it since James preferred John's side of the family over the hillbilly inbred side. Grinning, James told David he was well aware of what those hillbillies had been up to from the day he arrived. He often overheard Paul Sr. telling customers about his desire to break James's wild spirit. He knew how strong James was becoming and didn't want to risk being embarrassed by his grandson. James and David consider Daniel, who is between a rock and a hard place. He wants to support James completely, but feels disloyal to Paul Sr., who has always treated him well. He knows he can show James and the rest of the pack where his loyalty lies by helping James with his plan. So Daniel grabs the poison and returns to the truck while James and David say their goodbyes. Back at the farm, James and Daniel begin to spray every plant with the poison, trying to ensure that most, if not all, of the plants and vegetables are covered with the poison. Working quickly before everyone returns home, they hope their plan will work successfully. They hear heavy footsteps behind them as they progress, but don't look back, only quicken the pace. Regardless of how quickly they move, the footsteps behind them move just as quickly. Not looking to see what's behind them, they head back to the house, through the crops. Upon reaching a hilltop, James sees that the house isn't that far away. Daniel is distracted since the footsteps have gotten louder and closer. Looking back towards Daniel, James sees the oldest, meanest bull they have on the farm, and it's staring a hole right through Daniel. James shouts a warning to Daniel to avoid the bull at all costs, but not to try to outrun the bull because that would be impossible to do. With that, the bull charges and lunges at them. Oh, bless me! Okay. Bull charges and lunges at them as they jump down from the hill, missing them. It hits and gets tangled in the barbed wire fence. James walks over to the bull with and removes a machete from his belt. He and Daniel stare at the bull as it continues to struggle to free itself from the wire. James asks Daniel to kill it. They can't set it free because it would only attack and attempt to gore them once more. Daniel agrees that setting the bull free would be a horrible idea, but he doesn't want to kill it either. As an alternative, he recommends breaking the fence to allow the bull to escape on its own. It keeps them out of danger, and James nods in agreement, knowing that Daniel didn't want to get his hands dirty. They move on to opposite ends of the fence and push down the poles, causing the bull to go crashing down to the ground. It's breathing heavily and has a panicked look in its eyes. Having freed the monster that just tried to kill them, they head back towards the top of the hill, and once they reach the peak, James throws rocks at the bull to try to get it to move. But the confused and enraged animal jumps to its feet again and plows through the wires instead of walking through the section that was already down. It gets caught up in more barbed wire and succeeds in castrating itself. Jesus. Roaring out in pain, James is dumbfounded and Daniel is horrified, almost as if he were feeling the bull's pain. Oh my God. That sucks. Thunder. While James and Daniel followed the sounds and go to watch from the porch, James heard Paul Jr. screaming from the other side of the farm. The bull was dying and nothing could be done to save it. Grinning from ear to ear, James looks over at Daniel while they wait to hear about anything else going wrong. The bull's dying was a bonus, but what James is waiting to hear about is how much of the poison has spread throughout the farm. Ow! Cut it out. Play in a second. Outraged, Paul Sr. wants to know what happened to the bull, but is reluctant to call out James on it. Knowing that it would lead to more confrontations, and James has proven they would only escalate quickly, he thinks it might be best to have Hannah talk to James as a buffer to protect them from the boy. It's clear he was willing to take things to a new level, and Paul Sr. is concerned with just how far James might take things, but doesn't believe James would go after Hannah, his own mother. Around 2 in the afternoon, while some of the farm workers were busy digging a grave for the bull, other farm hands realized that most of the plants had fallen over and the remaining one didn't look very healthy. They were all dying and the vegetables were developing holes throughout them. Something none of them realized earlier, as they were all busy digging the grave, realizing the entire harvest had been compromised. The head farmhand, Fred, approaches Paul Sr. to deliver the devastating news, adding that in its condition, except for a few surviving vegetables, the harvest can't morally be given away or sold, and what is sellable won't cover everything that's owed to the workers. Paul Sr. seethes in anger. As it is, Paul hadn't paid his workers in 2 weeks and had promised a huge payday with interest from the profits of his harvest. The workers had been looking forward to the weekend's big payday, but with the harvest ruined, some of the workers started to walk out, feeling that Paul had taken advantage of and lied to them. Frustrated, he looks at the farm and the dropping plants, trying to make sense of the devastation. James and Daniel looked on from the villa, enjoying their hard work, but James enjoyed it the most. Seeing Paul Sr. lowered his head in defeat, knowing that this was a major loss, which will take a long recovery. In the long run, it will affect the sale of the livestock as well, as that is the big income earner over the holidays. That night, after Hannah fell asleep, James, with a bat in his hand and Daniel by his side, went straight to the hog pen. There were 2 giant hogs marked for sale and several smaller pigs that were to be killed and roasted. Paul Sr. was out late, searching for a way to make some more money and avoid further problems with the workers. With Daniel serving as a lookout, James bashed the hogs between the eyes with a baseball bat and then jumped into the pen to slash their throats. When all was said and done, James had killed 12 pigs and 4 hogs, leaving only the piglets because they weren't big enough to be sold or cooked, so there was no point in killing them. The slaughter of the animals impacted Paul Sr., but Paul Jr. as well, since he was the one responsible for the animals, since it had become too much of a hassle for Paul Sr. Not satisfied with ruining the crops and livestock, it took James several days and some patience to fully get Paul Sr.'s routine down. His grandfather is a creature of habit and rarely does things any differently, so it was fairly easy to pinpoint where he'd be at any given time of the day. Early one morning, soon after the farm events, James managed to sneak into Paul Sr.'s bathroom and covered the toilet seat with super glue. He saw Paul Sr. walk into the bathroom, and there wasn't any type of reaction for about 20 minutes. Finally, James could hear Paul Sr. calling out for Anastasia to come help, but didn't hear her respond. James knew Paul was unable to lift his ass or legs off the toilet, and that his call for his wife was no doubt to help him break free. Ultimately, Paul Sr. forced himself off the seat with a scream as he tore off some of the flesh from his legs and butt cheeks. Tears rolled down his face in pain, while tears of laughter rolled down James's face at what he imagined must have been a hysterical sight. James only wished he had managed to glue his grandfather's balls to the seat as well. Heading back upstairs, James tells Daniel everything that had happened, leaving Daniel wishing he had been there. Leaving Daniel wishing he had been able to observe, but he tells him he had a conversation with Tanya. She had sent him a picture to show James. She also wanted to show James to know how James was doing, and this caught James off guard since they haven't talked in so long. Looking at the picture, James sees that Tanya looked better than ever, even more beautiful than before. And the moment he saw her eyes, James remembers exactly why she was she was his first love. Those green eyes will lead him to do things he would never consider doing for anyone else. Smiling, he thinks to himself that Tanya's eyes were never the problem. She truly was one of the greatest people in his life when he didn't have anyone outside of the pack. She was the one constant good thing in his life. And not just because she was beautiful inside and out, but also compassionate and understanding. Everything was fine in the relationship with just one major exception. He had hoped she would want to venture out into the world outside of the comfort zone with him, but Tanya didn't want to leave town. She was inextricably involved with her family and wanted James to work on the issues within his family. But James was on a completely different life mission, and despite genuinely loving Tanya and feeling the pain of his decision, his main objective was to get far away from the entire town and everyone involved in it. With the benefit of hindsight, James still doesn't regret not committing to Tanya, but does believe he would have handled the situation completely differently. He would have told her how much she meant to him often, not just after sex. So she would know how he felt about her and how much she had done for him without ever even realizing it. Something he couldn't say about or to anyone else. Throughout the years, James would often reflect on how she supported his goals and kept pushing him towards them on a regular basis. Even when he felt there was nothing left for him to give, he missed, appreciated, and respected everything about her and realized how opposite his relationship was with Monica. Monica sensed the connection and was jealous, and they still communicated. Was jealous that they still communicated. So in her insecurity, she put an end to their friendship. James started to hate Monica for her interference and removal of everyone and everything important in James's life. Daniel continues to tell James that Tanya encountered a fair share of terrible situations once he left, and always hoped he would return to the farm and look for her. Despite knowing deep down that it was only a dream, since he despised the family and town so intensely. Saddened, James responded by saying it was never his intention to cause her any pain. She'd been too kind, and even after knowing that James was leaving, she didn't treat him any differently. He treated her differently, though, after she declined his request to join him and leave. It brought their relationship to the brink of extinction. At one point, Paul Sr. had tried to get into Tanya's head before she left for one of James's fights. Paul told her that James wouldn't amount to anything because he's not one of them, and that will hold him back since he'll never have the support from the townspeople. Without the right people, Paul said, no one could ever make it big anywhere. Tanya looked Paul Sr. in the eyes and told him that with all the respect in the world, she'd have to disagree. She had seen James's work ethic and how dedicated he was to make something of himself because he didn't want to be anything like Paul or the rest of the family. The one thing James has is passion, and passion that's lit by hatred, his hatred towards them. That's what allowed him to push beyond any limits he thought existed within himself. She continued, telling Paul that to have someone who's meant to be a loving fixture in their lives to be the cause of such suffering and beyond reprehension. James doesn't need his family or the town since he already has the support of a true family, the only family that matters, one that he created with the pack. And the pack will be stronger through the years since they all know who their alpha is and have never and will never question James. Always standing by his side and never allowing any harm to come to him or any of them, as a matter of fact. None of that would have been possible if his natural family members hadn't been such assholes towards him. Knowing that Tanya wouldn't say something so disrespectful if she didn't fully believe it, Paul Sr. begins to wonder how much his eldest grandson really does hate them all. Tanya knows she managed to get through to the old man. Reflecting on Tanya's words, Paul walks out to James's car and waits for James to come down, wanting to have a short conversation with his grandson. But when James approached, Tanya smiled at Paul, causing confusion to grow while James walked right past Paul and got into his car. Once the car door closed, Paul snapped out of the confusion and called James to lower his window so he could hear what Paul had to say. Paul started off by saying it's true that they have never seen eye to eye. It might be because he always hated John and his family, but that doesn't mean he can't have a relationship with his grandson. After all, James is still his first grandson, and despite everything, he does have a certain amount of love for James in his heart. Unsure of what to make of the statement, James got out of the car. Paul went to embrace James in a hug, but James stopped it by extending his left arm, keeping Paul at bay. He tells Paul there's no need for an emotional moment since that time has long passed and something he no longer desires. He has found a substitute that makes him feel so much better than any of them ever could. Uneasy, Paul begs James not to take things personally and hopes they can build towards a better life together. James rebuffs the sentiment by saying there's no relationship between them to save. There aren't any emotional ties with any of them, and that day that they're all dead and buried will be the happiest day of his life. It is then that Paul realized that the depths of James's hatred for them. Disquieted, Paul walks away and James jumps back in the car and heads towards his match. Tanya is torn because she was proud of James but felt horrible for having encouraged Paul after seeing the expression on his face when realizing that it's too late to try to change James's mind. Seeing how detached James has become, she tries to convince James not to give up on everyone else because of a few bad people in his life. But the more she pushed James to open up emotionally, the harder it became for them to continue their relationship. James kept putting up walls between them because he didn't want to hurt Tanya in any way. He viewed it as a way to protecting her from himself. Months went by, and the strain was becoming too much on James because the internal conflict was tearing him apart. This came to a halt after one of his best matches. Tanya ran over to him to celebrate, but James feigned indifference to seeing her. When she hugged him, he returned it in kind. But the moment she went to kiss him, James pulled back. Confused, Tanya didn't understand, so asked him how he would like to celebrate. James told her he couldn't and had a training session later that night. Unhappy, confused, and annoyed by the answer, she knew that James was lying. She was one of his training partners and, as his girlfriend, hadn't heard of any late session. So she asked if there was another girl he was interested in. Offended by the question while understanding the reasoning behind it, James explained there isn't another girl, but he had instead found someone whom he felt would help him improve his performance and elevate it to an entirely new level. It would, however, mean that there wouldn't be enough time to spend with her, and that would hurt them both in the long run. Unsure what to make of it, Tanya tried to get more information from James, but all he offered was that going forward, Tony would oversee his training. It was his idea to eliminate any distraction and emotion in order to succeed. This would be by far the hardest thing he's ever had to face because he absolutely loves her more than anything else in the world. Getting close to James and looking him in the eyes, Tanya tells him she will always be there for him because he means the world to her, and she will always have a special place for her in her heart for him. Daniel, on hearing about James's past with Tanya, begins to tear up. James offers him a tissue and tells him to man up because it's ancient history and they're both in different places now. Daniel reflects on how bad James was when he was the Dark Wolf and hopes that if James were to have a child, it would inherit that trait from James. He continues to note the time James was suspended from school after a fight with Bob, a friend who he lent some money and was never repaid. Not an unusual scenario for Bob. This time, James wasn't going to overlook it as he had numerous times in the past, and kicked Bob's ass so severely that Bob barely made it out alive. Knowing how much he hated it and working alongside his grandfather, Hannah forced James to work on the farm while he was on suspension, but she instantly regretted the idea when James's anger issues took over. Paul kept yelling at James, who was working with a machete in his hands cutting weeds. He took a swing at Paul, nearly catching his throat. James missed by less than half an inch, causing Paul to drop to the ground out of fear for his life. The following day, Paul tried a different approach. Knowing that James won't deal with any type of abuse, he grabbed a ladder and placed it against a tree, telling James to climb to the top and grab a few oranges. James refused and said he would hold the ladder for Paul, who should get the oranges himself, something that Paul wasn't willing to argue about, especially after the machete incident. With Paul now at the top of the tree and off the ladder, James threw the ladder to the ground, telling him to find a safe way down from the height. Paul becomes irate and starts to belittle James, calling him an asshole, spoiled brat, and some entitled little shit. Entertained by Paul's outburst, James reminds Paul of the time James and his friends were wrestling on the second floor of the villa when Paul threw him off the second floor onto the backyard without anything to land on except the grass. Paul quiets down. Nervously, Paul had responded by saying he knew James could handle it, and he would never intentionally put his grandson in any real danger because he loves James. James burst out laughing the instant the words came out of Paul's mouth. At that point, trying to control his laughter, James suggests that Paul relax and roll into a little ball like an armadillo and bounce off the tree. Unable to control his temper any longer, Paul stomps on the branch and it snaps and he comes crashing to the ground near James's feet. James is amazed at how stupid his grandfather truly is. Extending his hand, James tells Paul that this is the way it will always play out. They will always be looking up to him for forgiveness and acceptance after a fight they started. After the fall, things changed. Paul tried keeping a distance from James, fearing for his well-being. After all, it was the second time in 2 days that James tried to kill him. At least that's how Paul viewed it. Paul explained to Hannah about the incidents with James and his concern that he will act out against her as well. She puts his mind at ease, explaining that even though he has a bad temper, he's still her son, adding that a child will always need their mother. She also reminds Paul that James is just acting off of the survival tactics he learned from John and Marlon, but to remember that they have something valuable to James in their back pocket. They have 2 members of his pack, Daniel, but more importantly, Tanya. Tanya will always want to check in on her, and Daniel is viewed as another son. Hannah says they should feel a little more at ease with the situation since he believes who better able to understand her son than the person who brought him into the world. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 4. Next one will be chapter 5, Losing Hope, and we will continue that next time. So until then, please remember to like, share, subscribe. Tell me how I'm doing. Tell me if you like the story. That's it. See you next time. Bye.